Hey there. Tonight, I want to ask you a question that sounds simple until you sit very still with it. What did Earth really feel like during the Ice Age? Not the cartoon version, not the neat little picture of a white planet and a few shaggy animals moving across it, but the real thing, the long, cold truth of a world ruled by ice, dust, giant footsteps, and human firelight trembling in the dark. Because the darker truth is this: for thousands upon thousands of years, whole continents lay under crushing walls of ice. Oceans pulled back and exposed vanished lands. And creatures larger than anything we know now wandered through a pale and restless silence. Somewhere in that silence, our own ancestors were learning how not to disappear. If this is the kind of quiet mystery you like to fall asleep with, leave a like and subscribe. Only if it feels right. Then settle in with me now. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let your jaw unclench. Feel the room around you soften. Let the light grow dim in your mind, as if the fire has burned lower and the only thing left is its warm pulse against the dark. Breathe in slowly. Breathe out even more slowly. We are going very far back tonight, farther than memory, into a world that was harsh, beautiful, and patient beyond anything modern life usually allows. When people say the Ice Age, it often sounds like one single frozen event, as if the Earth slipped into a white silence and stayed there unchanged. But that is not what happened. The Ice Age was an era, immense and layered, millions of years long, made of repeating breaths of cold and relative warmth. Glacial periods came, then eased. Ice advanced, then retreated. The world froze, softened, then froze again. Over and over. The changes were so slow that no ordinary life could have stood in one place and watched the whole thing happen. You would have needed a mountain for a heartbeat and an ocean for memory. I have always found that the phrase Ice Age sounds so blunt, so simple. It hides too much. It hides the long waiting. It hides the low, pale sun. It hides the way snow could survive one summer, then another, until it stopped being snow and became pressure, and then age, and then blue ice older than any living voice. Picture the world with me. You are standing where northern Europe might one day be, or northern North America, or a stretch of Siberia so broad and open, it feels like the edge of thought itself. The horizon is not broken by towers or roads or electric wires. There are no engines, no cities, no distant aircraft dragging bright lines through the sky. Instead, far ahead, there is a wall of ice. Not a little sheet of frozen water, but a presence. A continent of cold rising like a silent cliff, glowing faint blue where cracks open into depth. The air tastes dry, almost metallic. Every breath feels thin and sharp. Under your feet the ground is hard, wind scoured, and dusted with old snow. And yet the land is not empty. Out there, moving slowly across the open steppe, come the mammoths. Their coats hang in dark, shaggy folds. Their tusks curve forward like crescents of pale bone catching the weak light. Each step presses deep into the frozen earth. You do not hear them all at once. First, it is only a faint rhythm. then a deeper one, then the full, heavy language of a herd in motion. Somewhere farther off there are bison, dark as weather against the snow. Somewhere beyond them, almost invisible until they move, a predator keeps low in the grass, waiting with all the patience of winter itself. And farther south, beyond the reach of the thickest ice, rivers still move. Forest patches still cling to the earth. In those places, human beings gather near fire. Their tools are stone and bone. Their shelters are hide and tusk and willpower. They do not think of themselves as prehistoric. They do not know they are living inside a chapter that we will one day name and study. For them, this cold world is simply the world, the only one there is. That may be the first truly important thing to understand tonight. The Ice Age was not experienced as an age. It was lived as weather, hunger, movement, shelter, the smell of fur drying near fire, the ache in the fingers after handling snow, the relief of warm marrow, the low voices at dusk. Deep time always looks dramatic from a distance. Up close it feels like ordinary life, repeated under unusual skies. The world of the Ice Age was also not uniformly frozen. That matters more than people sometimes realize. The North was locked beneath immense sheets of ice. Yes, but near the equator, warmth still held. Jungles still breathed in green shadows. Deserts still stretched and shifted. Rivers still flooded and withdrew. The planet was colder overall, but it remained varied. It remained alive. What changed was the balance, the proportions. Cold expanded. Dryness spread. The edges of habitable land moved. Forests shrank in one place and waited in another. Grasslands opened like enormous wind-swept stages. And this movement, this grand rearranging of water, air, and land, would shape everything that followed. The ice did not arrive like a curtain dropping. It crept. That is the eerie part. It came so slowly that a person would not have seen a continent change in a lifetime. They might only have noticed that the winters bit harder than the stories of the elders said they once had, that a snowfield lingered later into spring, that a valley where meltwater used to run clear was now blocked by a hard, bright mass that never seemed to shrink, that herds were taking slightly different routes, that some birds stopped returning, that the wind carried more dust. Honestly, that is how the largest changes often begin. Quietly. In increments so small they almost escape feeling. Long before humans were central to this story, Earth had already been shifting between cold and warmer states. The planet is never still. It turns. It tilts. It wobbles very slightly on its axis. Its path around the sun is not perfectly fixed. These subtle motions change the amount of sunlight reaching different parts of the globe, especially the north. A cooler summer means more winter snow survives. More surviving snow means more reflection of sunlight. More reflection means more cooling. More cooling means more surviving snow. The cycle deepens itself. A little cold invites more cold. A little white brightness gives birth to more white brightness. Scientists learned this by listening to the archives trapped in ice and stone. Deep in Greenland and Antarctica, ice cores preserve thin annual layers. Tiny bubbles of ancient air remain imprisoned there, each one a sealed breath from another time. Dust from long-dead winds is trapped in those layers too. Ash from distant eruptions, chemical traces of warmth and cold. When researchers lift those cores into the light, they are not just holding frozen water. They are holding climate memory. From these records and from the marks left on the land, we know the glaciers advanced, retreated, and advanced again. They were not inert shapes resting on the world. They moved. Slowly, yes, but with unstoppable force. A glacier is a river that has forgotten how to be liquid and learned instead how to crush. Under its own pressure, it creeps outward and downward, always moving, though no ordinary eye could mark its daily advance without patience and a reference point. If you were standing near one of these early great glaciers, the first thing you might notice would not be motion, but sound. Not constant sound. Mostly silence. Then, once in a long while, a crack. Deep, abrupt, echoing. The report of internal stress giving way. Somewhere inside that pale mass, weight shifts. Pressure redistributes. Old ice breaks against older ice. Then silence again. A silence so complete you can hear fine snow grains skittering across the ground. And then there is the light. Glacial light is unlike ordinary winter light. In crevasses and broken faces there is that impossible blue, cold and luminous, as if the sky itself has been folded inward and trapped. Standing near it, you would feel smaller than your body deserves to feel. There are some landscapes that reduce language. This is one of them. As these ice masses expanded, they joined into sheets large enough to bury the architecture of continents. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet spread over immense distances, covering most of Canada and pressing deep into what is now the northern United States. In Europe, the Fennoscandian ice sheet spread over Scandinavia and beyond. These were not mountain glaciers tucked between peaks. These were continental presences, wide enough to alter air circulation, weather patterns, drainage systems, even the weight distribution of the crust beneath them. The earth itself bent under that burden. What the ice did to the surface was equally profound. Forests were crushed or pushed southward. Valleys were widened into broad U-shaped troughs. Bedrock was scratched, polished, and ground down. Huge stones were torn from their source regions and carried far away inside the moving ice. Fine rock flour, stone ground almost to powder, accumulated beneath and beyond the glacier. When the cold later released its hold, this material would become part of future soils and river systems. But during the height of glaciation, it was simply evidence of raw force, the land being rewritten. Let us slow the scene again and walk along the edge of one of these giant ice sheets. On one side, a frozen wall. On the other, a bleak open country of gravel, meltwater channels, and wind. The air is so dry it seems to pull moisture from your lips as you breathe. Here and there, stones lie in jumbled heaps. A stream, born from melt at the glacier's edge, runs gray with suspended silt. Its water is bitterly cold, so cold the hand aches almost instantly if dipped into it. The smell is faint but real. Whetstone, fresh earth, newly exposed after ages of burial. Nothing about such a place invites comfort. And yet it is not dead. Moss and lichen will eventually begin the slow work of return. Hardy grasses will find purchase in pockets of sediment. Insects will come when conditions allow. Birds will appear. Then grazing animals. Then predators. Then human beings, following all the others with watchful eyes and durable memory. As the ice sheets grew, they locked away so much of Earth's water that sea levels fell dramatically. The coastline of the world did not stay where modern maps place it. It moved outward, revealing broad continental shelves and dry lands now lost under modern seas. Beringia rose between Asia and North America, not as a narrow bridge, but as a sweeping cold country of its own. Doggerland linked Britain to mainland Europe. The Sunda Shelf connected islands and peninsulas in Southeast Asia into much larger, continuous land. These lost lands are some of the most haunting parts of the Ice Age story. Not because they were mythical, but because they were real. Real ground. Real weather. Real animal paths and human crossings. Places once walked, hunted, slept on, and remembered by living minds, now lying beneath cold water and storm-driven seas. At the same time, as water was stored in ice, much of the climate became drier. Winds moved easily across exposed plains and glacial margins. Dust rose in enormous quantities from barren outwash zones and from land newly stripped or exposed. It settled in layers we still find today, thick blankets of fine particles that would one day become fertile soil. During the Ice Age, these were part of a restless aerial world. Pale sky, ground haze, wind working constantly across open country. And still, despite all of this severity, the cold world made room for life. In one sense, the glaciers were destroyers. They crushed and buried. They erased familiar terrain. They denied passage. They forced adaptation. But they were also sculptors and eventual makers. When they retreated, they would leave valleys, lake basins, redirected waters, and new ecological opportunities in their wake. It is one of the great paradoxes of the Ice Age that the same force which made survival so difficult also built the foundations of many future landscapes. For the beings living then, though there was no future perspective, only immediate adaptation. Animals shifted their ranges, plants withdrew, endured, or colonized fresh ground. Small life found shelter under snow. Great herbivores moved across open steppe. And eventually humans, careful, observant, and never fully safe, entered deeper into these changing spaces. It is dusk now in the world we have been imagining. The sky is fading toward iron gray. The glacier face ahead of you holds the last weak light. A stream runs at its foot, carrying the powdered memory of mountains. Wind comes off the ice like something emptied of kindness, but also emptied of malice. Just cold. Just pressure. Just the planet doing what the planet does, overspans too long for fear to matter much. That sensation is the doorway into the Ice Age. Because the cold was not merely weather. It was architecture. It built boundaries, routes, deserts of snow, oceans of grass, and pathways between continents. It rearranged coastlines and carved the skeleton of the future. It prepared the stage on which mammoths would roam, predators would follow, and human beings would learn the long disciplines of warmth, cooperation, and memory. In the next part of our journey, the ice will no longer be enough by itself. We will have to watch what lived beside it, and because of it, the giants. The hidden life under snow. The great cold-adapted web of fur, hoof, tooth, and fire. Only then does the frozen world begin to feel complete. The cold did not fall on the world like a curtain. It came almost politely at first, in increments so small they would have felt like nothing more than a few stubborn winters, a few summers that failed to clear the high ground, a few late thaws that left snow resting where older people thought it should have disappeared. That is how something immense often begins. Not with spectacle, but with repetition. If you were alive near the beginning of one of these long descents into glacial cold, you might not have believed anything grand was happening at all. A valley path remains white longer than it used to. A patch of hard snow endures in a shaded hollow all year. The meltwater comes later. Then another year passes, and the same patch is still there. Thicker now, dirtier at the edges, layered with old storms. Generations later, what was once a stubborn little field of lingering snow becomes the first seed of a glacier. I have always found that deeply unsettling, in a calm sort of way. The idea that worlds can change through persistence rather than drama. That a continent can be captured because summer grows just a little weaker and never fully recovers. The first part of this process was written high above the ground, in motions no one could see by looking up. Earth circles the sun, but not in a perfectly fixed way. Its orbit changes shape over immense spans of time. Its axis tilts a little more, then a little less. It wobbles, slowly, endlessly. These shifts sound tiny, and they are. But over tens of thousands of years, they change how sunlight is distributed, especially in the northern hemisphere. A cooler summer means winter snow melts less completely. And when snow survives one year to the next, everything begins to build upon that fact. Fresh snow is bright. It reflects sunlight. So the more snow remains, the less heat the land absorbs. Less absorbed heat means more cooling. More cooling means more surviving snow. It is a loop, gentle at first, then self-strengthening. The earth, once nudged, begins helping the cold along. Imagine a northern plain before the great ice sheets fully took hold. There are forests there, open areas too, rivers running with seasonal certainty. Then centuries pass. The winters sharpen. Trees struggle at the edge of their range. The summers do not have the same force they once did. Snowfields persist higher and farther south. What falls in one year no longer vanishes. It compresses under the next winter's burden. Air is squeezed out. Crystals tighten together. What was loose and powdery becomes dense, granular, then harder still. At last it becomes glacial ice, blue in depth, opaque in pressure, carrying within it the memory of each season that fed it. Once enough of this ice forms, it begins to behave like a body with weight and direction. That is one of the strangest facts in the story. Ice, given enough mass, flows. Not quickly, not in any way a living thing would call motion, but undeniably, a glacier is movement slowed almost beyond imagination. Under its own pressure, the ice deforms and begins to flow outward and downward, always moving, though no ordinary eye could mark its daily advance without patience and a reference point. If you were standing near one of these early great glaciers, the first thing you might notice would not be motion, but sound. Not constant sound. Mostly silence. Then, once in a long while, a crack. Deep, abrupt, echoing. The report of internal stress giving way. A hidden fracture opening. Somewhere inside that pale mass, weight shifts. Pressure redistributes. Old ice breaks against older ice. Then silence again. A silence so complete you can hear fine snow grains skittering across the ground. And then there is the light. Glacial light is unlike ordinary winter light, where snow reflects broadly. Thick, ancient ice can hold color. In crevasses and broken faces there is that impossible blue, cold and luminous, as if the sky itself has been folded inward and trapped. Standing near it, you would feel smaller than your body deserves to feel. There are some landscapes that reduce language. This is one of them. As these ice masses expanded, they joined into sheets large enough to bury the architecture of continents. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet spread over immense distances, covering most of Canada and pressing deep into what is now the northern United States. In Europe, the Fennoscandian ice sheet spread over Scandinavia and beyond, claiming northern regions with the same slow certainty. These were not mountain glaciers tucked between peaks. These were continental presences, wide enough to alter air circulation, weather patterns, drainage systems, even the weight distribution of the crust beneath them. The earth itself bent under that burden. That may sound poetic, but it is plain geology. Rock is strong on the scale of our daily lives. Yet, under enough pressure and enough time, it yields. The crust beneath the great ice sheets was pressed downward by the tremendous mass above. When the ice later retreated, that land began to rise again, very slowly, rebounding from a weight that had rested on it for millennia. In some places, that rebound is still happening now. The planet is still answering an old pressure. What the ice did to the surface was equally profound. Forests were crushed or pushed southward. Valleys were widened into broad U-shaped troughs. Bedrock was scratched, polished, and ground down. Huge stones were torn from their source regions and carried far away inside the moving ice. Fine rock flour, stone ground almost to powder, accumulated beneath and beyond the glacier. When the cold later released its hold, this material would become part of future soils, river systems, and agricultural abundance. But during the height of glaciation, it was simply evidence of raw force, the land being rewritten. Let us slow the scene again and walk along the edge of one of these giant ice sheets. On one side, a frozen wall. On the other, a bleak, open country of gravel, meltwater channels, and wind. The air is so dry it seems to pull moisture from your lips as you breathe. Here and there, stones lie in jumbled heaps. A stream, born from melt at the glacier's edge, runs gray with suspended silt Its water is bitterly cold. So cold, the hand aches almost instantly if dipped into it. The smell is faint, but real. Wet stone, fresh earth, newly exposed after ages of burial. The mineral scent of a landscape not yet softened by roots. Nothing about such a place invites comfort. And yet, it is not dead. Moss and lichen will eventually begin the slow work of return. Hardy grasses will find purchase in pockets of sediment. Insects will come when conditions allow. Birds will appear, then grazing animals, then predators, then human beings following all the others with watchful eyes and durable memory. But before that life fully recolonized the raw edges of the ice, the climate system itself had to deepen and stabilize its cold. Orbital changes began the shift, but they were only part of the machinery. The climate is never governed by one force alone. Once the ice expanded, it increased the planet's reflectivity, sending more solar energy back into space. Oceans cooled and in cooling absorbed and stored carbon differently. Lower greenhouse gas concentrations reinforced the cold. Sea ice expanded in places, further brightening the planet's surface. Winds changed. Currents shifted. What had begun as a slight imbalance became a reinforced state. And still the world did not become simple. That is important. Even in the depths of an ice age, change continued. The cold varied in intensity. Some glacial periods were harsher than others. There were intervals of retreat. There were pulses, stutters, reversals. The climate breathed in long cycles, and within those cycles, smaller fluctuations rippled outward through ecosystems and migration routes. A valley open for centuries might later be blocked. A grassland rich with game might dry or freeze into poorer country. A river might alter its path because ice melt pooled elsewhere. Nothing stable remained stable forever. Volcanoes sometimes added their own dim hand to the process. A great eruption can loft ash and sulfur high into the atmosphere, reducing incoming sunlight and cooling the surface for years. In a world already near thresholds, those interruptions mattered. Ocean circulation mattered too. Heat carried northward or withheld could alter entire regions. The story of the Ice Age is a story of thresholds crossed, feedbacks reinforced, and balances tipped slowly, then held for astonishing lengths of time. Yet when I think about all that science, all the orbital mechanics and gas ratios and thermal circulation, I still return to one small image. Snow left on the ground after summer should have taken it. That quiet refusal to melt, that is where the giant future begins. Not with a roar, but with leftovers. As the ice sheets grew, they locked away so much of Earth's water that sea levels fell dramatically. The coastline of the world did not stay where modern maps place it. It moved outward, revealing broad continental shelves and dry lands now lost under modern seas. Beringia rose between Asia and North America, not as a narrow bridge, but as a sweeping cold country of its own. Doggerland linked Britain to mainland Europe. The Sunda Shelf connected islands and peninsulas in Southeast Asia into much larger, continuous land. The planet's familiar shapes loosened and rearranged themselves. These lost lands are some of the most haunting parts of the Ice Age story. I think, not because they were mythical, but because they were real. real ground, real weather, real animal paths and human crossings. Places once walked, hunted, slept on, and remembered by living minds. Now, lying beneath cold water and fishing routes and storm-driven seas. The world we know is only one version of the coastline. There were others. At the same time, as water was stored in ice, much of the climate became drier. The atmosphere held less moisture. Winds moved easily across exposed plains and glacial margins. Dust rose in enormous quantities from barren outwash zones and from land newly stripped or exposed. This dust traveled across continents. It settled in layers we still find today, thick blankets of fine particles called loess. During the Ice Age, these were part of a restless aerial world. Pale sky, ground haze, wind working constantly across open country. If you were standing in such a place, you might see the distance softened by drifting dust and fine snow. The sun would seem weaker than its brightness suggests. The air would not smell like lush growth or wet leaves, but like dryness, stone, and exposed earth. Even sound would carry differently, more thinly at times, more sharply. A raven's call, the crack of ice, the scraping of grit over frozen ground. And still, despite all of this severity, the cold world made room for life. In one sense, the glaciers were destroyers. They crushed and buried. They erased familiar terrain. They denied passage. They forced adaptation. But they were also sculptors and eventual makers. When they retreated, they would leave valleys, lake basins, till, fertile sediments, redirected waters, and new ecological opportunities in their wake. It is one of the great paradoxes of the Ice Age that the same force which made survival so difficult also built the foundations of many future landscapes. You know that feeling when you stand somewhere and sense that the land has a much older mood than the one visible at first glance. A lake that feels too deep, a valley too smooth, a boulder too large and too lonely in the wrong place. That feeling often belongs to the old ice. The world still carries those gestures. It still remembers being pressed, scraped, and released. For the beings living then, though, there was no future perspective, only immediate adaptation. Animals shifted their ranges. Plants withdrew, endured, or colonized fresh ground. Small life found shelter under snow. Great herbivores moved across open steppe. And eventually humans, careful, observant, and never fully safe, entered deeper into these changing spaces. But before we spend time beside their fires, I want to linger one moment more at the edge of the great ice. It is dusk. The sky is fading toward iron gray. The glacier face ahead of you holds the last weak light. A stream runs at its foot, carrying the powdered memory of mountains. Wind comes off the ice like something emptied of kindness, but also emptied of malice. Just cold, just pressure, just the planet doing what the planet does, overspans too long for fear to matter much. Far off behind you, there may be the movement of animals, perhaps a herd crossing the open plain, perhaps only your imagination making company in a vast place. You stand there and feel, more than think. that the world is larger than any story a single generation could tell. That sensation is the doorway into the Ice Age. Because the cold was not merely weather, it was architecture. It built boundaries, routes, deserts of snow, oceans of grass, and pathways between continents. It rearranged coastlines and carved the skeleton of the future. It prepared the stage on which mammoths would roam, predators would follow, and human beings would learn the long disciplines of warmth, cooperation, and memory. In the next movement of our journey, the ice will no longer be enough by itself. We will have to watch what lived beside it and because of it. The giants, the hidden life under snow, the great cold adapted web of fur, hoof, tooth, and fire. Only then does the frozen world begin to feel complete, and only then can we understand what Earth was really like when the ice held dominion. By the time the ice had settled into its rule, life had already begun answering it in 1,000 quiet ways. That is one of the gentlest and strangest truths about the Ice Age. The cold did not erase life. It edited it. It took away ease, stripped back abundance, narrowed the margin for error, and in doing so forced every living thing to become more exact. Under the snow there was movement. I think people often imagine the frozen world as empty, simply because so much of it was pale and still from a distance. But if you knelt and pressed your ear to the ground, if you could have done that without numbing your skin against the hard crust, you might have heard the faint, hidden life below. Small mammals tunneled through the insulated dark beneath the snowpack. Voles, lemmings, and other little survivors made pathways through that white ceiling as if it were a second landscape turned upside down. Above them, the air could bite hard enough to still the fingers. Below, the temperature remained steadier. Snow, for all its cold appearance, could shelter. It trapped pockets of air. It softened the worst of the wind. It allowed tiny hearts to go on beating in a place that looked impossible from the surface. That hidden layer mattered more than it seems. Those small animals fed foxes, owls, wolves, and all the restless hunger moving over the steppe. Life during the Ice Age was built not only from spectacle, not only from mammoths and rhinoceroses and great cats with terrible teeth, but from little motions under snow, from roots surviving underground, from grasses waiting for brief warmth, from beetles and larvae and the fine patient economy of persistence. Then there were the giants. The mammoths are the first to arrive in the imagination, and perhaps they should be. If you were standing here with me on that open plain, with wind pressing the fur at your collar and the sky hanging low and white above us, I think the first thing you would notice would be scale. The mammoths were not just large. They altered the emotional temperature of space. They made distance feel inhabited. A herd moving at the edge of the world could look like a shifting line of weather. Dark humps and pale tusks. The slow rise and fall of backs furred against the cold. Their coats were layered. Coarse outer hair and dense underwool. Fat sat thick beneath the skin. Their bodies held warmth the way a banked fire holds ember. Their tusks curved outward and inward in great crescents, useful for display, defense, and perhaps even for clearing snow away from buried grasses. Their feet spread their weight over difficult ground. Their blood and flesh were suited to cold in ways that still astonish us. Some preserved remains show not just bone but skin, fur, stomach contents, even the texture of a life interrupted and sealed by frost. There is something haunting about that, I think. To look at a mammoth pulled from permafrost and realize the grass in its mouth once grew under an ice age sun. Then to look at the fur still clinging to its hide and understand that between that moment and ours, there lies an abyss of vanished winters. Mammoths were not alone. Mastodons moved through more wooded regions, browsing among trees rather than grazing open steppe in the same way. Woolly rhinoceroses crossed the grasslands as well, broad and formidable, their horns sweeping forward like tools cut from old moonlight. Steppe bison gathered in powerful herds. Reindeer and ancient horses moved in constant negotiation with season, distance, and predators. Musk oxen, low and dense and ancient in their patience, stood in tight circles when threatened, horns out, calves protected in the middle. Size was one strategy, for another. Movement, another. Caution, another. The whole world was an arrangement of answers to the same cold question. Predators sharpened the edges of that question. Saber-toothed cats remain the most famous, and I understand why. Their long, curved canines seem almost too dramatic to be real, like something memory would invent after the fact. But they belonged to flesh and hunger, not fantasy. These cats were not built like modern cheetahs or wolves meant for long pursuit. They were more compact, more muscular through the forequarters, more suited to ambush and explosive force. One imagines them waiting in broken ground or brush, their breath controlled, their bodies still until the exact right instant. Then the rush, the wait, the leap. In a world already ruled by cold, they added another kind of precision. Dire wolves crossed these same regions too, heavier than many wolves of today, their jaws powerful, their endurance formidable. Cave lions ranged across Eurasia with quiet confidence, not identical to the lions we know, but close enough in spirit to stir recognition. Hyenas, bears, raptors, scavengers of every scale, all took part in the same great exchange. Nothing could afford waste. A kill meant life rippling outward through the web, first to the hunter, then to the waiting pack, then to the lesser scavengers, then finally to insects, soil, and weather. In such a world, death was rarely still for long. It was distributed. Honestly, that may be one reason the Ice Age feels so intense, even from a great distance. The cycles were exposed. Hunger was visible. Survival moved openly across the land, on hooves and paws and human feet. And then there were the humans, small by comparison, but already becoming something difficult to dismiss. They did not dominate this frozen world. Not at first. Perhaps not ever in the way modern people might like to imagine. They endured it. They watched it. They learned how not to be broken by it. That is a different kind of greatness. Picture a small band crossing the margin of the Mammoth Steppe. Their clothing is layered fur, stitched carefully so wind cannot easily find the seams. Their boots are wrapped and insulated. Their tools hang from cords, stone blades, scrapers, awls of bone, points ready to be hefted. Smoke lingers in the fibers of their clothes from last night's fire. Their hair catches frost at the edges. Every object they carry has weight in the most serious sense. To lose a tool here is not inconvenience. It is exposure. It is risk moving closer. They travel because the land requires movement. Herds migrate. Seasons transform shelter into danger and danger into opportunity. Rivers freeze and thaw. Valleys fill with drifted snow. Wood is scarce in some regions and must be gathered where it can be found, carried, rationed, or replaced by bone and dung as fuel. There is almost no part of such a life that can be careless. And yet these humans were not only surviving from hour to hour. They observed patterns. They remembered routes. They taught. That matters. A species becomes truly dangerous to hardship when it can pass on more than instinct. Early humans, and in some regions Neanderthals alongside them, were doing exactly that. Knowledge accumulated in bodies and gestures and stories. Which valley stays passable later into winter? Which grasses attract herds after light snow? Which stone fractures cleanly in the hand? Which hide is best for boots? How long marrow keeps? When the river ice sings before it breaks. Those things may sound small from the far side of modern comfort. They are not small. They are civilization in seed form, memory organized against death. The shelters of Ice Age humans reveal some of this quiet intelligence. In treeless or nearly treeless regions, they could not depend on timber in the way later peoples might. So they used what the land and the hunt offered. Mammoth bones, tusks, ribs, and hides could be turned into structures. Imagine the labor of that, the dragging and arranging of heavy curved bones, the fitting together of a frame under bitter wind, the stretching of hides over it, the pegging and weighting down, the sealing of gaps. Inside, perhaps, bedding of grasses or fur, a fire hollow, the smell of smoke trapped in hide and clothing, the sound of breath in a close, warm place, while outside the dark keeps moving across the snow. I have always found those shelters deeply moving. Not grand, not permanent, but intimate proofs that intelligence is often most beautiful when it is practical. When it says, "The world is trying to freeze us, so here is how we answer." Fire was the center of that answer. It is hard to overstate what controlled fire meant in an Ice Age landscape. Warmth, yes. Light, yes. But also cooked food, softened marrow, hardened wood, protection against predators, drying wet clothing, shaping social space, giving the night a boundary. Around a fire, a human group becomes more than scattered individuals enduring weather. It becomes a circle, a shared interior, a place where one mind can hand something to another without using the hands at all. If you were seated with them, you might hear low voices, not hurried, not many words wasted. A child half asleep against a wrapped figure. Someone scraping a hide with steady rhythm. Someone checking a spear point with thumb and nail. The fire breathing softly, sending resinous scent and sparks up toward the roof. Outside, somewhere beyond the reach of the glow, The snow reflects a little of that light and then loses it. Beyond that, only distance. The longer one sits in such a scene, the clearer another truth becomes. The Ice Age was not simply making bodies adapt. It was shaping attention. It rewarded patience, planning, cooperation, memory. In a world where one storm or one failed hunt could undo the week, a group had to function as more than a cluster of hungry individuals. It had to become a vessel for shared skill. This is also where art begins to feel less surprising. Because even in a harsh age, or perhaps especially in a harsh age, human beings made images. They painted mammoths and horses and bison on cave walls. They carved forms from ivory and bone. They left handprints, marks that feel startlingly intimate across time, as if a person simply paused, pressed a palm to stone, and said in the most ancient possible way, "I was here. I saw this world. It passed through me." We cannot know exactly what those paintings meant. Some scholars think they were tied to ritual or hunting. Some think they were teaching tools. Some think they were woven into systems of meaning we can only guess at. It is debated, and we cannot be sure. But whatever the exact reason, they tell us something undeniable. These people were not mentally dim figures trapped in a brutal age. They were observant, symbolic, expressive, and capable of carrying beauty into difficult places. That matters tonight because it changes the emotional shape of the Ice Age. It was not merely a trial. It was also a world in which consciousness deepened. Under the pressure of cold, human beings did not become less human. They became more recognizably so. And still, danger remained close. To walk beyond the camp was to leave one form of order and re-enter the open negotiation of the wild. Predators could shadow a herd you hoped to hunt. Weather could turn. A river that looked firm could split beneath its surface. Snow could conceal hollows, thin ice, or the remains of last season's death. Every excursion carried the possibility of not returning, which makes the quiet courage of ordinary movement in such a world almost impossible not to admire. Now let us widen the lens once more. Across the Mammoth Steppe, the herds continue moving. Beneath the snow, the small lives continue tunneling. Wolves test the edge of the dark. A human camp settles into night around its contained sun. Far away, the glacier groans in its sleep, still advancing, still holding much of the world's water in frozen silence. Nothing in this world is soft, but neither is it empty. It is alive at every level, from the invisible stirring beneath snow to the shadow of a mammoth crossing a ridge under the pale moon. And in that layered life, in that great tension between cold and persistence, the Ice Age finds its true character. In the next part, we will follow that character into motion again, into the paths carved by ice and meltwater, into changing seas, exposed lands, and the vast Mammoth Steppe itself, where the planet became larger, stranger, and more open than the modern mind usually allows. The world of the Ice Age was not only colder than ours. In many places it was larger. That sounds impossible at first, but it is true in a simple physical sense. So much water was stored in the great ice sheets that the oceans withdrew. Shorelines moved outward. Continental shelves emerged from beneath the sea. What we now imagine as fixed edges of continents were, for long stretches of the Ice Age, something else entirely. Dry ground, wind-cut plains, river valleys, grazing territory, migration routes, human pathways, animal country. There is something almost sorrowful in that thought. Whole landscapes existed, carried lives, held weather, then disappeared beneath water so completely that modern people travel over them in boats and ferries without feeling the slightest shift of recognition. Beringia is perhaps the most famous of these vanished places. Today, the Bering Strait separates Asia and North America with cold water and drifting ice. During lowered sea levels, that space became a broad landmass, not a narrow crossing, but an entire region of steppe and tundra stretching across the distance. Herds moved there. Predators followed. Human groups, over generations, crossed into lands no ancestor had seen and no map had named. Not because they were seeking a continent in the dramatic sense, but because they were following life and opportunity the way living things always do. Imagine standing there on Beringia. The wind cuts long and low across a plain that seems to have no end. The ground is frozen, but not lifeless. Grasses survive. Caribou and mammoths travel in shifting lines. Snow lies in broken patches, depending on wind exposure. The air smells of cold soil and animal movement. Behind you is one continent. Ahead of you is another. But to the people walking this land, it is not a bridge between worlds. It is simply the world. That may be one of the most useful ways to approach deep time. Not as a stage set for our future categories, but as a present reality for those inside it. Doggerland was not a drowned archaeological label to the people who once hunted there. It was home ground between what we now call Britain and mainland Europe. The Sunda Shelf was not a geological concept. It was habitable land linking places modern water has separated. The coastlines of the Ice Age had their own estuaries, hunting zones, marshes, dunes, tracks, shelter points, and stories. Then the water returned. Before it returned, though, these expanded lands reshaped the movement of life. Animals followed exposed corridors into new ranges. Humans did the same. What had once been a sea barrier became a route of inheritance. A species could cross over many human generations without any moment of revelation. A few families move, then more. Then children grow up thinking the new valley is ordinary. Then their children move farther. The earth opens, and life spills slowly through the opening. At the same time, the open landscapes of the Ice Age created one of the greatest ecosystems the planet has known, the Mammoth Steppe. I have always liked that phrase, Mammoth Steppe. It sounds almost too elegant for what it describes, because the place itself was severe. But it was also astonishingly productive, stretching across enormous portions of Eurasia and into North America. This was not a forest world, but a cold, dry grassland world, rich in herbs, sedges, and hardy grasses, adapted to short growing seasons and intense seasonal contrast. The key to its richness was not warmth, but balance. The climate was cold, yes, but also relatively dry in many steppe regions, Snow cover was not always deep enough to choke all grazing. Dust carried mineral nutrients. The vegetation stayed low and dense and resilient. Trees were kept at bay in many places by dryness, cold, grazing pressure, and the overall climate regime. What resulted was an enormous grazing biome capable of supporting shocking numbers of large herbivores. If you stood on a ridge above it, the view might feel almost oceanic. Wind moving over grass like currents. Herds spread out in dark clusters. A mammoth line in the distance. Bison near a stream. Horses shifting as one body and then separating again. Here and there, the dark dots of human figures or predators, too small to read clearly at first. The sky above it all feels huge. There is so little vertical obstruction that the mind starts to notice horizontal distance in a different way. This is a land that teaches migration. It teaches scanning, following, anticipating. Woolly mammoths fit this world perfectly. So did woolly rhinoceroses, steppe bison, reindeer, ancient horse, musk oxen, and all the predators that shadowed them. Every hoofbeat was part of the larger engine. Grazers converted grass and sedge into muscle and fat. Predators converted vulnerability into survival. Scavengers and smaller creatures took what remained. Humans entered this system as hunters, scavengers, observers, and eventually one of the most flexible participants in the whole arrangement. The mammoth steppe also changes the emotional scale of prehistory. It reminds us that early humans were not eking out existence in tiny isolated corners of a barren world. They lived within a biologically rich, cold system of tremendous scale. Harsh, yes. Dangerous, certainly, but rich. That richness is important because it helps explain how both animals and humans could persist across such difficult climates. And then there was the dust. It sounds small beside mammoths and glaciers, but dust was one of the great unseen authors of the Ice Age world. Glaciers grinding rock into fine powder, bare outwash plains exposed to relentless wind, continental shelves dried and open. All of this fed enormous dust movement. The sky in some regions would not have held the clean blue sharpness modern winter fantasies often imagine. It could be hazed, muted, fine particles hanging in the air, settling over snow, grasses, camps, eins, rivers. These winds built lowest deposits in parts of the world. Thick blankets of fine silt dropped over long periods. In places like northern China, Europe, and North America, those deposits would one day become famously fertile soils. During the Ice Age, though, they belonged to a harsher beauty, a world where wind could write geography grain by grain. Imagine one of those days. The sky not storming exactly, but veiled. Light, thin, and pale. Wind dragging a skin of dust across the ground so that exposed stone hisses softly. Snow fills some hollows and leaves others bare. In the distance you can just make out moving animals through the haze. You lower your head against the cold. Fine grit gathers at the corners of your eyes and in the seams of your clothing. This is not a dramatic blizzard. It is worse in a quieter way. Endurance weather, the sort that wears the body by persistence rather than shock. And still the world goes on. Humans move through this steppe with increasing skill. They read tracks where we might see only confusion. They know when a herd has passed recently and when the marks are old. They distinguish the print of a wolf from that of another dog-like creature. The broken edge of snow made by fresh hooves from the softened collapse of older ones. They know which valleys trap wind and which offer a little shelter. They know where stone can be found, where water remains beneath ice, which direction the animals are likely to turn if pressed too hard. You know that feeling when you begin to understand a landscape so deeply it stops feeling empty and starts feeling full of instruction. Ice Age humans must have lived inside that feeling constantly. Their survival depended on intimacy with terrain, not ownership, not domination, intimacy. This is one reason I think the modern word primitive fails so badly when applied carelessly to deep human pasts. There is nothing primitive about knowing how to survive on a frozen grassland under a sky full of dust, with mammoths on one horizon and wolves on the other, carrying all the material intelligence of your group in what you wear, what you remember, and what you can make with your hands before nightfall. The sea's withdrawal also changed coastal life in ways we can barely reconstruct. River mouths extended farther. Shelves that are now drowned held animal trails and perhaps repeated human use. Camps near those coastlines are largely gone to us now, hidden beneath marine sediment or lost under changing currents and erosion. Some of the most lived-in lands of the Ice Age may be some of the least accessible to archaeology now. I have always found that strangely sad. So much ordinary life, the most precious kind, really, likely happened in places we can no longer easily touch. And yet we do have clues. Fishing nets have dragged up worked objects from drowned landscapes. Sonar maps reveal ancient river channels where there is now only seafloor. Sediment records hint at vanished coasts and floodplains. Piece by piece, the outline of those lost worlds returns. Not enough to restore them, but enough to remind us they were there. Then, too, the Ice Age sea was not only lower, in many regions it was colder, and its circulation interacted with climate in powerful ways. Ocean currents help distribute heat across the globe. Changes in freshwater input, sea ice coverage, and temperature could shift those currents, influencing regional climate far from the source. The planet during the Ice Age was a tightly linked system. Ice affected oceans. Oceans affected air. Air affected vegetation. Vegetation affected animals. Animals affected humans. Humans, in turn, learned to read those outcomes in immediate local form. Picture again the open plain, but this time, not in winter dusk. Let us visit during the brief intensity of Ice Age summer. The sun sits higher now. Snow remains only in patches. The grasses and herbs answer with urgency. Flowers appear low to the ground. Insects thicken in the air. Bird calls sharpen the edges of morning. Meltwater runs stronger in channels cut by old ice. Herds spread farther as food becomes abundant. For a few precious weeks, the land feels not gentle exactly, but generous. That brief generosity matters. It is the hinge on which the whole system swings. Animals must feed heavily. Humans must hunt, gather, repair, travel, prepare. Fat reserves built now mean winter possibility later. Hides must be processed, tools made, knowledge passed on before the cold narrows attention again. There is no wasted season, only compressed opportunity. And then autumn begins, almost before the mind has caught up with summer. The air clears and hardens. Morning crust forms on puddles. Migratory birds gather in intention. Herds turn. The first truly cold wind arrives and everyone understands what it means. That rhythm, open season, movement, preparation, constriction, is the pulse beneath Ice Age life. It is why movement mattered so much, why land bridges mattered, why low seas mattered, why the Mammoth Steppe was not just a biome, but a corridor of existence. It is also why the end of the Ice Age would prove so destabilizing, because anything built on cold eventually faces the possibility of warmth. The open plains that sustain giant grazers would not remain open forever. Forests were waiting at the edge of the system. Water was waiting in the ice. Coastlines were waiting to redraw themselves. The larger the Ice Age world became under lowered seas and broadened steppe, the more dramatic its retraction would later feel. But we are not there yet. For now, the steppe still holds. The coasts are still far out. Beringia still exists as land. Doggerland still sees footfall. Rivers run across places now buried by sea. Dust still moves over open country. Mammoths still feed. Human fires still burn low against the dark. If you were walking here at day's end, your boots biting into dry, cold ground, you might stop and look over an exposed plain that modern maps have hidden from us. You would see tracks crossing each other, herd over herd, season over season. A fox slipping between them, raven shadows lengthening. Perhaps smoke, faint and far off, from another human camp. The whole world would feel at once enormous and inhabited. That is the emotional truth of Part 4. I think the Ice Age did not make Earth smaller through cold. It made it wider through withdrawal and exposure, then filled that widened world with movement. Giants, predators, and humans all traveling under a pale and patient sky. In the next part, that patient sky will begin to change again. We will move closer to human life within this world, to tools, shelters, fire, memory, and the long, difficult grace of survival in a place where everything could be lost to cold. And yet so much was learned. Humans did not meet the Ice Age as heroes stepping into a legend. They met it as small, warm bodies in a world that had very little interest in warmth. And yet, little by little, with smoke in their lungs and frost on their sleeves, they learned how to remain. That may be the quiet miracle at the center of this age. Not the mammoth, not the glacier, not even the vastness of the steppe. It is the fact that a fragile creature with bare skin, thin fingers, and children that needed years of care managed to survive under a sky that could kill in a single hard night. If you were standing beside one of their camps, the first thing you might notice would be how low everything was. Their shelters did not rise proudly into the wind. They crouched. They pressed close to the ground, as if trying not to attract the attention of weather. In treeless places, and there were many, people built with what the world surrendered to them. Mammoth bone could become structure. Tusks could arch into curved frames. Hides stitched and stretched across those frames could hold back the moving cold. Stones weighted the edges. Snow itself might be packed along the base as insulation. Outside, the shelter looked temporary, almost tender in its vulnerability. Inside, it could mean the difference between life and loss. I have always found that contrast beautiful. The enormous bones of a giant animal, the careful labor of human hands, the soft interior glow of a fire contained within a structure that was both grave gift and future promise. The mammoth had died. Its body entered the human story. Bone became home. Hide became wool. Sinew became thread. Fat became fuel. Nothing in the Ice Age was allowed to remain only one thing. Inside those shelters, the air would have been close and warm by comparison with the brutal dark outside. Smoke would have gathered in the upper space, clinging to hide, hair, and fur. The smell of cooked meat, singed bone, damp leather drying near heat, all of that would have mixed into something instantly recognizable to anyone who has ever sat near a fire while winter pressed at the walls. A child might sleep curled against an older body under layered skins. Someone near the entrance might be scraping fat from a hide with a stone tool in small, steady motions. Someone else might be turning a point of bone in the hand, feeling for flaws. There would be little waste of movement. Energy mattered too much. Fire stood at the center of all of it. Without fire, Ice Age life narrows toward impossibility. With it, people could create a human zone inside inhuman cold. The flame did more than warm. It transformed. Tough meat softened. Marrow loosened. Bone blackened and cracked in useful ways. Wood, where it could be found, hardened at the spear tip. Darkness was pushed back enough for hands to keep working after sunset. Predators, who knew hunger as well as humans did, thought twice before crossing that shifting ring of light. Fire also gathered people into relation. Around it, memory could be spoken aloud. Techniques could be shown. Warnings repeated. Plans revised. You know that feeling when everyone in a room becomes quieter, not because there is nothing to say, but because something important is being held there together. A winter fire must have felt like that. Each flame a shared answer to the same danger. Tools grew more precise in such a world because imprecision was punished. A poor point might glance off hide. A weak seam might open in wind. A dull scraper might waste time the weather would not return. So stone became extension of thought. Flint and chert, when struck carefully, offered edges finer than one expects from rock. Hunters shaped blades long and narrow, points sharp enough for deep penetration, scrapers broad enough to clean and soften hide, burins and awls, suited to finer work. Bone and antler added other possibilities. Hooks, barbed points, needles, wedges. Every material was tested for its character. Every object was part of a long conversation between hand and necessity. And necessity, in the Ice Age, was rarely abstract. A coat was not fashion alone. It was temperature turned into craft. A boot was not simply clothing. It was the ability to cross frozen ground and return with all toes still alive. I think modern people forget how intelligent clothing is. Stitching hides into shapes that hold warmth and still allow movement requires observation, patience, and repeated correction. Bone needles found from later Ice Age contexts tell us something very intimate. Someone had realized that warmth could be engineered, that seams could be placed where strain was lower, that layers trapped air, that grass or fur could be used as insulation, that one kind of hide was better for soles, another for drape, another for lining. These are not tiny details. They are the architecture of survival, worn on the body. Then there was hunting, which demanded not only courage, but social trust. Large Ice Age prey could not always be taken by a single person, and often should not be attempted that way at all. A mammoth hunt, if it occurred, required planning, knowledge of terrain, timing, coordination, and no small amount of nerve. More often, I suspect, humans took what made sense. Reindeer, horses, bison, smaller game. Opportunities opened and closed with season, terrain, and risk. A group had to choose carefully where to invest effort. Calories spent in pursuit had to justify calories gained. Wounds carried consequences. A broken leg in such a world was a sentence spoken softly, but clearly. That is why cooperation matters so much in this period. Alone, a person could be observant and skillful and still disappear into cold. Together, a group could hunt, carry, process, repair, watch, and teach. One person gathers fuel, another checks the edge of the river ice, another stays with children, another works hide, another follows tracks. Human intelligence in the Ice Age was not merely individual cleverness. It was distributed. It lived in groups. And groups remembered. No one wrote these lessons down. Not in ink. Not in symbols we can recover as language. But they were stored anyway. In story, imitation, rhythm, warning, and repeated action. This valley drifts deeply when the wind turns north. Do not sleep low near that river in late thaw. The reindeer cross there after first hard frost. Use this stone for points, not that one. Do not waste the marrow. Keep the child closer in whiteout. Watch the birds. If the wolves fall silent, listen harder. Such things become culture long before culture has monuments. Some scholars argue that this kind of transmitted practical knowledge was among the greatest evolutionary advantages humans ever developed. I think that feels right. A body dies. A remembered technique outlives it. The Ice Age favored that kind of inheritance. Yet for all the practicality of this life, humans still made room for beauty, and that may be the most moving part of all. Deep in caves, far from weather, they painted animals on walls that would outlast nations. Horses with heavy necks, bison with lowered heads, mammoths with sloping backs and curved tusks, reindeer in motion, rhinos, lions, handprints, dots and signs and forms whose meanings may now be beyond us. The paintings were not clumsy. They show observation of muscle, posture, and movement. They show memory sharpened into line. They show care. Why make such things in an age of cold and danger? We cannot be certain. It is debated. They may have been linked to ritual, teaching, memory, or some form of symbolic world-building we only dimly understand. But even without certainty, their presence changes the story. These people were not only enduring winter, they were also making meaning inside it. They were looking at the animals they depended on, feared, tracked, admired, and turning them into image. They were saying, in effect, this matters enough to keep. If you imagine the scene slowly, it becomes almost hypnotic. A torch sputtering against cave air, resin scent and smoke, rock surface breathing in light and darkness as the flame moves. Someone crouched, grinding pigment. Someone else tracing a line already known in the hand before it reaches the wall. The sound of breath, drip water somewhere deeper in the cave. Outside, a frozen world. Inside, the deliberate act of leaving a mark. There is no need to force modern categories too hard upon it. Whether art or ritual or memory, the point remains. A species living among glaciers, mammoths, dust storms, and predators still wanted to place image inside stone. That desire feels deeply familiar. The same creative force appears in carvings and figurines. Small forms shaped from bone, antler, or ivory. Some animals, some human bodies, some stylized, some mysterious. The so-called Venus figurines from later Ice Age Europe are especially striking, with their rounded forms and repeated emphasis. Their meaning is uncertain. Fertility, identity, protection, teaching, sacred symbolism, perhaps some mixture we no longer know. What matters is that they existed. A person sat with a piece of material and imagined a form hidden inside it, then brought that form outward. In a world ruled by cold, the human mind was still making symbols. Music may have been there too. Bone flutes have been found from Upper Paleolithic contexts. And once you know that, the whole emotional landscape shifts. Imagine that for a moment. Night outside. Wind around a shelter or cave mouth. Fire low and breathing. Children half asleep. Someone lifts a carved flute of bird bone or mammoth ivory and sends a thin tone into the dark interior. Not for hunting, not for warmth, not for cutting or sewing. Simply for sound, for pattern, for feeling shaped into air. That may be one of the most intimate survivals from the Ice Age. The evidence that even then, people needed not only shelter for the body, but resonance for the spirit. And still, all of this happened under pressure. The cold did not pause because a painting was beautiful. Predators did not spare the careless because someone could carve ivory well. The weather remained stern. Winters remained long. Children still sickened. Hunters still failed. The old still slowed. Bodies were buried or left or mourned in ways we can only partially recover. There are graves from the Ice Age that suggest care, ornament, and intention in death as well as life. Beads, ochre, positioning, The dead were not always discarded. They were attended to. Honestly, I have always found that detail almost unbearable in the quietest way. To survive under such conditions and still gather enough energy to honor the dead means that love, grief, and ritual had already taken deep root. The Ice Age did not strip humanity down to an animal minimum. It revealed what stayed when almost everything unnecessary fell away. By now, if you look carefully at the shape of this world, you begin to see the deeper lesson. The Ice Age forged human beings not by making them invincible, but by demanding flexibility. We learned to read landscapes, to store knowledge socially, to plan beyond the present meal, to build temporary worlds of warmth against overwhelming cold, to create meaning when meaning had no obvious material reward. That is a kind of strength different from the mammoth size or the wolf's teeth. It is quieter, more fragile at first glance, but more enduring. Because when the climate began to shift again, when grasslands moved, coastlines changed, and the world that had shaped these people started to soften and transform, humans would carry forward what they had learned. Fire, cooperation, memory, clothing, tools, art, the ability to remain human in conditions that seemed built to erase comfort. In the next part, we will follow them and the great Ice Age animals into the beginning of that transformation, into the warming world, the shrinking steppe, the last great floods, and the long fading of the giants whose shadows once filled the frozen plain. The end of the Ice Age did not arrive with a trumpet blast. No voice announced that the frozen age was passing. No creature standing on the plain could have known it was living inside the final chapters of a world tens of thousands of years in the making. At first, there were only subtleties. Slightly longer warmth, slightly softer summers, meltwater running more freely along the edge of the ice. Then, little by little, the whole balance began to tilt. I think that is one of the darker comforts of climate. It can change everything without ever becoming dramatic enough in a single season to seem unbelievable. A child grows up with one pattern of winter. That child's grandchild notices the snowpack is thinner in places. A hunting path once reliable becomes marshy longer into spring. A river breaks earlier. Herds pause in different valleys. The world changes first through small betrayals of habit. The glaciers felt it before anyone else could name it. At their edges, summers bit a little deeper. Meltwater channels formed across surfaces that had once held their shape more sternly. Water ran under the ice as well, lubricating movement, hollowing spaces, weakening frozen certainty from below. The great white walls that had seemed immovable were always moving, of course, but now they also began to lose themselves. Imagine standing at the foot of such a glacier in those years of retreat. The face rises blue and white, streaked with dirt and stone carried over long distances in its body. At intervals you hear cracks travel through it like thoughts too large for speech. Meltwater drops in steady rhythms. Then somewhere deeper there is a boom. Not thunder exactly, but collapse. A fracture. A release. A piece of the old world giving way. You wait. The air feels colder near the ice, even in warming seasons. Water threads across gravel and disappears. Every sound tells you the giant is changing. When glaciers retreat, they do not withdraw neatly. They wound and remake the land as they go. Rivers burst from beneath them, loaded with silt and ground stone, milky with cold mineral life. Lakes form behind ice dams, or in great gouged basins where the weight of ice once pressed the earth down. Valley floors open in raw mud and shattered rock. Boulders dropped by melting ice sit absurdly far from their origins, as though the land itself had dreamed and misplaced them. In some places, the retreat paused or even reversed for a time. The climate system was never simple. The Younger Dryas is the best known of these reversals, a return to colder conditions after warming had already begun. Some scholars connect it to freshwater disruption of ocean circulation. Others have argued for more dramatic causes. It remains a subject of serious study and debate. But whatever the mechanism, the experience on the ground would have been clear enough. Just when thaw seemed to be claiming the future, cold returned with renewed authority. That must have felt terrible in a quiet, prehistoric way. Not apocalypse as cinema imagines it, but the slow closing of a door that had briefly stood open. Grasses failing where growth had begun. Herds thrown back into older patterns. Human groups forced once more into harder calculations. It is a reminder that the Ice Age did not leave gracefully. It lingered. It recoiled. It made the world earn every degree of warmth. And yet eventually, warmth prevailed. As the ice withdrew more decisively, the oceans answered. All that water, locked in the great sheets, began to return to the sea. Coastlines shifted inward. Plains drowned. Land bridges vanished. Beringia, once a lived landscape, disappeared beneath rising water. Doggerland, with all its quiet camps and hunting grounds and river mouths, slowly gave itself back to the North Sea. The exposed shelves that had once enlarged the earth were taken away again. It must have felt, over generations, as though the edges of the world were being eaten. I have often wondered what that did to memory. Imagine being told by an elder that there used to be rich hunting ground far beyond the place where waves now move. Imagine hearing that a stand of birch, a camp, a crossing place, a marsh full of birds, all of it now lies under gray water. We know that many flood stories appear later in human traditions around the world. Not all of them need come from the same source, and caution matters here. But the emotional truth is easy to understand. When the sea rises into remembered land, people tell stories about it. Hidden within the retreating ice age were also floods of staggering scale. Glacial lakes formed where meltwater pooled against remaining ice or trapped topography. Some of these lakes held impossible volumes, quiet on the surface perhaps, but always under tension. When their ice barriers failed, the release could be violent, beyond ordinary imagination. Water surged across land with a force that treated hillsides as inconveniences. It carved channels, stripped soil, moved boulders, and rewrote river systems in days or weeks. The Missoula floods in North America are among the most famous examples from the broader glacial period. Though there were many meltwater dramas in many regions, if you were standing far away, you might first hear it rather than see it. A deep, continuous roar, unlike storm or river, growing from the horizon. Then perhaps birds lifting, animals moving strangely, Then, the water itself, wide and furious, full of torn earth, broken ice, uprooted things, impossible velocity. Camps would vanish. Trails would vanish. Familiar ground would become a wound of stone and mud. In the wake of such floods, the land looked newly born and half-ruined at once. But the retreat of the ice did not merely destroy. It also prepared. The newly opened landscapes received fresh sediments. Lakes formed in glacial basins. Rivers found courses that would nourish later ecologies and future human settlements. As the climate softened, pioneer plants moved in. First mosses and lichens in some barren places, then grasses, then shrubs, then trees. Birch and pine advanced northward. Later, in many regions, forests thickened further with species suited to milder conditions. The Mammoth Steppe, once vast and coherent, began to fragment. And that fragmentation changed everything. The great grazing world had depended on openness, dryness, cold, and the long ecological habits of immense herbivore communities. As forests spread and moisture patterns shifted, the grasses and herbs of the steppe lost their uninterrupted kingdom. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, steppe bison, horses, musk oxen, and the predators that followed them found themselves in a world increasingly cut into pieces. Not everywhere at once, not all in the same way, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to begin the thinning of giants. This is where the story grows especially sad. Because the Ice Age animals were not monsters failing a moral test. They were specialists of a disappearing world. Their bodies had been masterpieces for cold grassland existence. Mammoths with insulating fur and fat and broad feet. Woolly rhinoceroses shaped for frozen plains. Cave lions and wolves tuned to prey moving across open country. The world changed faster than many of them could follow. Humans were part of this ending too. This does not require melodrama or guilt beyond evidence, but neither should it be softened into irrelevance. In many regions, human expansion overlapped with megafaunal decline. Hunting pressure added stress to populations already facing habitat loss and climate instability. The exact balance differs by continent and species. Some scholars emphasize climate. Others argue human hunting played a decisive role in many extinctions. Most likely, the story is mixed. A world under ecological pressure became less forgiving of any additional burden. And humans were a new kind of burden. Clever, cooperative, persistent, and increasingly widespread. One can almost feel the silence growing. A valley that once held tracks of mammoths each year receives them less often. A hunt that once expected bison finds fewer. Predators range wider and leaner. Bone piles grow older. Camp stories begin to include animals younger listeners have not seen. The world has not emptied yet. Not fully, but it has begun. Some giant animals lingered in refuges. Mammoths survived on Wrangel Island long after mainland populations were gone. Smaller and more isolated, like a last breath held too long. That detail always unsettles me. The idea that fragments of the old world remained out there on remote islands, still walking, still eating, still making tracks in snow, while elsewhere the age had already passed into memory. It feels like the earth refusing to close a chapter all at once. But close it did. Eventually, woolly rhinoceroses vanished. Saber-toothed cats were gone. Dire wolves disappeared. Giant ground sloths in the Americas, mastodon, the great short-faced bears. Many of the astonishing heavy lives of the Pleistocene faded into bone, sediment, and story. The herbivore engines that had helped maintain open ecosystems weakened. Forests advanced faster. Ecologies reorganized. The old cold balance could not be restored. Humans, however, adapted again. That may be the most consequential fact in all of this. The same species that had learned to survive in the Mammoth Steppe now learned to survive its loss. As open grasslands shrank in many regions, people adjusted to forest hunting, riverine resources, coasts altered by rising seas, and new patterns of seasonality. They took fish where there was fish, deer where there was deer, nuts, roots, birds, shellfish, and waterfowl. They changed toolkits. In some places, bows and arrows eventually became more important than thrusting spears built for larger prey. In others, smaller stone technologies expanded. Settlement patterns shifted. Memory shifted with them. Imagine one of these later Ice Age or early post-glacial communities looking out over a valley their ancestors would hardly recognize. Trees now thicken where there had once been open steppe. Birdsong carries from canopy. Wetlands occupy old channels. The air itself feels fuller, softer, more damp. The giant animals are fewer or absent. Children grow up learning a different list of tracks. The old stories remain, but the land no longer fully confirms them. And still there is promise in the thaw. Meltwater lakes and rivers created rich zones of life. New fisheries appeared. Wetlands attracted birds. Fertile sediments accumulated. In many parts of the world, humans began spending longer periods in favored places. Not yet cities, not yet states, but a subtle lengthening of stay, a deeper familiarity with returning to certain riverbanks, lake margins, and sheltered clearings. The ending of the Ice Age did not create agriculture in one simple motion, but it prepared some of the conditions in which later agriculture could emerge. This is one of the strange paradoxes of endings. The destruction of one world becomes the groundwork of another. The Ice Age had forged human resilience under severe conditions. Its retreat now offered new ecologies, new concentrations of resources, new chances for experimentation. The great floods destroyed and also nourished. The melting glaciers erased and also revealed. The vanished steppe broke the old order and made room for forests, rivers, and eventually fields. Even so, the old world did not vanish cleanly from the earth. Its signatures remained everywhere. Valleys carved by glaciers, great lakes filling scoured basins, erratic boulders resting far from home, loess soils built from old dust, permafrost preserving mammoth remains, raised shorelines, drowned shelves, meltwater channels, all the stone grammar of an age of ice. If you walk through Canada, Scandinavia, Siberia, the northern United States, parts of Britain and beyond, you are still walking through aftermath. Our species carries the inheritance of people shaped by cold, mobility, planning, cooperation, and ecological alertness. Their world is gone, but not gone enough to stop speaking. In winter light, in the curve of a valley, in a river that follows glacial logic, in the bones of a mammoth lifted from thawing ground, the Ice Age keeps returning in fragments. If you pause long enough with that thought, the modern world begins to feel thinner than it usually does. Beneath roads and farms and cities lies another Earth, an Earth of wind, steppe, glacier, giant hoofprints, and firelit shelters. An Earth where survival was daily and beauty still insisted on itself. An Earth that left behind not only sediments and fossils, but the conditions from which our own age eventually rose. And perhaps that is the gentlest way to end Part 6. Not with extinction alone, though extinction belongs here. Not with flooding alone, though flood belongs here too. But with transition, a vast cold world loosening its hold, giants fading into silence, humans walking forward carrying lessons learned under immense pressure, forests moving north, seas climbing back, rivers widening, the first softer mornings arriving over land once buried in ice. In the next part, we will trace the lasting echoes of that vanished, frozen age, the marks left in stone, soil, water, weather, animal survival, and human memory, and how the Ice Age, though long ended, still lingers under every modern landscape shaped by its patient hand. By the time the last great walls of ice had retreated into the far north, the Ice Age had already done its deepest work. It had shaped not only the creatures that survived it, but the very bones of the earth itself. The Frozen Age did not leave behind a ruined city or a single monument that says plainly, "I was here." It left something larger and quieter. It left the world. That may sound like too large a claim at first, but if you stand still long enough and let the modern surface thin a little in your imagination, you can begin to see it. The valley in front of you, broad and smooth-bottomed, may once have been carved by a moving wall of ice. The lake beyond it may be the melt-filled scar of a vanished glacier. The boulder, resting alone in a field, may have traveled farther than any person ever carried it, locked in frozen motion for centuries before being dropped in a place where it did not belong. The rich soil under a farmer's hand may be dust lifted by Ice Age winds, settled patiently, grain by grain, across an empty plain. I have always thought there is something haunting about that kind of inheritance. Not dramatic, not loud, just everywhere. A world shaped by forces that no longer operate at that same scale before our eyes, and yet remain present in forms so ordinary that most people pass them without a second glance. The Ice Age survives by becoming background. Look north and west across the old glaciated lands of Europe and North America, and the signs gather quickly. U-shaped valleys, long, low hills of till, scattered erratic stones, too large and too misplaced to explain any other way. Kettle lakes, where buried blocks of ice melted into hollows. Moraines, marking the old pauses of retreat. Even the Great Lakes themselves are part of this memory. Their vast inland waters, occupying basins gouged and shaped by Laurentide ice. What feels permanent to us is in many places the aftermath of movement, pressure, grind, thaw. And beneath those visible shapes lies another archive, more delicate and more exact. Deep inside Greenland and Antarctica, ancient ice still holds the air of vanished worlds. Each winter's snowfall pressed down upon the one before it. Year after year, century after century, until the weight turned weather into record. Tiny bubbles of atmosphere were sealed inside. Dust settled into faint bands. Volcanic ash left its signatures. Temperature changes marked themselves in isotope ratios too subtle for the eye, but clear to instruments and patient minds. When scientists pull up these long cylinders of ice, what they are really doing is reading breath trapped by time. They are lifting cold libraries out of the ground. In those frozen pages lies the rise and fall of carbon dioxide, the rhythm of glacial advance and retreat, the sudden shocks of volcanic winters, the long murmur of planetary change. It is difficult not to feel reverence for that. The atmosphere we inhale now once existed in other proportions, under other skies, above Mammoth Steppe and ice walls and camps of people who had never seen a farm or a city. The bubbles remain. Their makers do not. And then there is permafrost, that old locked ground. In Siberia and the high Arctic, the Earth still keeps some of the Ice Age in cold storage. Mammoths emerge from thawing banks, with fur still clinging to skin, stomachs still carrying traces of grasses eaten in another climate. Bones and tusks appear from mud that softens each summer a little more than before. Sometimes, even the smell of old flesh is said to linger when the frozen bodies are opened to light again. I find that both eerie and tender, as though time itself had not quite finished digesting the age of giants. The animals that remain also carry the old world within them. Musk oxen, standing broad against Arctic wind, their coats hanging heavy, seem like direct fragments of the Mammoth Steppe. Caribou and reindeer still follow migration patterns written by ancient pressure, season, and geography. Arctic foxes turn white against snow that once extended much farther south. Bison remain, diminished in number and range compared with their Ice Age abundance, but still recognizably children of that harder world. Even elephants, far away in warmer lands, are reminders that the mammoth was never a fantasy creature, only a branch of a family that continues. And humans, we carry the age perhaps most strangely of all. Not in fur, or tusk, or horn, but in behavior and memory and the routes our ancestors once took. The low seas of the glacial world opened pathways. Beringia allowed movement between Asia and North America. The exposed shelves around Southeast Asia changed coastlines, distances, and possibilities. Populations shifted with climate windows. Small bands learned to travel, observe, cooperate, and improvise in severe conditions. Those habits did not disappear when the glaciers did. They were carried forward into newer worlds. If you were standing with one of those late Ice Age groups as the thaw continued, you might notice how much of life was still built on attention. The call of birds over meltwater, the texture of mud under a foot that tells you where the river changed course, the difference between new grass and old sedge, the way a valley catches morning frost longer than another, the smell of wet earth where there had been ice only a few generations before. These are not small things. They are the first languages of adaptation, and from them eventually would grow larger settlements, seasonal returns, deeper landscape knowledge, the beginnings of place that could become home in a more settled sense. Yet memory does not preserve everything equally. Some of the Ice Age entered story. Some entered land. Some entered genes. Some vanished almost completely. We should be honest about that. The past is never recovered whole. It is rebuilt from traces, and traces favor certain kinds of survival. Bone lasts where leather rots. Ice preserves what open air would erase. Stone remembers what speech cannot. This is true for the Ice Age, just as it is true for every age. Still, there are moments when the lost world feels unusually near. A winter morning over a frozen plain can do it. A broad, pale sky, low sunlight, animal tracks, crossing snow, the quiet weight of cold, and suddenly the modern world feels very thin. You can almost imagine mammoths in the distance, or a cluster of people moving beside a river wrapped in furs, carrying spears and memory together. Not because ghosts are real in some simple way, but because landscape keeps old habits. Snow on open ground still teaches the eye what movement once looked like here. And then there are the caves, those patient chambers where human hands marked stone in the deep, cold age, and where some of that work still remains. Mammoths, horses, bison, lions, signs we cannot fully read. Every time I think about those paintings, I return to the same feeling. We are not just looking at animals. We are looking at attention made durable. Somebody saw a body in motion, a slope of back, a set of horns, a turn of head, and decided that the image needed to remain after the animal itself had gone. That is one of the most human acts in all of time. To notice, to keep, to pass forward. The Ice Age also leaves a warning. Not in the moralizing tone people sometimes force onto the past, but in a quieter way. It reminds us that climates move, that coastlines are not fixed, that ecosystems can collapse and reform, that enormous animals can vanish, that abundance can thin, and that whole ways of life can become impossible even when they once seemed as permanent as the horizon. The Frozen Age is not only a vanished wonder. It is a lesson in instability stretched across millennia. Some scholars emphasize this when they speak about our own century. The Ice Age shows how sensitive the Earth system can be to changes in sunlight, greenhouse gases, ocean circulation, and ice feedbacks. A planet can transform gradually and still utterly. The world most creatures assume to be normal is often only a temporary arrangement. This truth can feel unsettling. It can also feel clarifying. We are not outside Earth history. We are inside it. And perhaps that is why the story of the Ice Age continues to matter so deeply. Not because mammoths are dramatic, though they are. Not because glaciers are grand, though they are that too. It matters because the Frozen Age stands at the threshold of our own becoming. In that world, humans learn to survive with planning, clothing, tools, fire, art, cooperation, and story under difficult conditions. Those capacities did not melt away with the ice. They remained and deepened. Everything later, village, temple, city, machine begins somewhere back there, in a shelter of hide and bone, a hand shaping flint, a fire held through the night. You can almost trace it if you let yourself move slowly enough. A hunter reads tracks in snow. Later, a farmer reads seasons in soil. Later still, a navigator reads currents and stars. A painter on a cave wall learns to hold memory in image. Much later, a scholar holds memory in text. A group gathers around fire and passes survival knowledge by voice. Far later, another group gathers around a table, a screen, a radio, a printed page, doing the same thing in another form. The technologies change. The human urge to pass meaning forward does not. So when we say the Ice Age ended, that is true in climate terms. But in a deeper sense, it never ended cleanly. It lingers in our landscapes, our sciences, our species distributions, our old migration routes, our myths of flood and winter, our fascination with giant bones and vanished beasts, even our feeling that cold carries a special kind of ancient authority. Winter still has that effect. A hard wind across open ground can make time feel longer than usual. A frozen lake can seem older than the map that names it. Snow can silence a place so completely that one begins to hear older possibilities moving underneath. If you were to walk now through a northern valley shaped by ice, perhaps near dusk, perhaps with frost beginning to settle on the grass, you might notice how much of the world is made of old pressure. The ridges, the stones, the stream cutting through glacial sediment, the lake holding the sky in a hollow the ice carved before your language existed, and you might feel gently, not fear exactly, but scale. The scale of what came before us and shaped what we think of as ordinary. There is peace in that if you allow it. We did not inherit a finished world. We inherited a worked world. A world ground, flooded, frozen, thawed, grazed, hunted, painted, and crossed long before our own names entered it. To remember the Ice Age is to remember that the Earth has worn many faces and will wear others still. There are other whispers too. Los plains in China and elsewhere hold wind-blown dust laid down during cold, dry centuries, a gift of fertility from an age of hardship. Raised beaches mark old shorelines where meltwater and rebounding land argued after the ice withdrew. In parts of Scandinavia and Canada, the crust is still lifting very slightly, still recovering from the enormous weight it once carried. The Earth remembers pressure for longer than any civilization remembers history. That fact alone is enough to humble a person if they stand with it long enough. And perhaps the deepest echo of all is psychological. Cold worlds produce a special imagination, one tuned to scarcity, distance, movement, and patience. Even many of our myths about winter, darkness, flood, wandering, and return may carry faint emotional traces of long adaptation to glacial realities. We should be careful not to turn every story into a literal survival of Ice Age memory. Still, the recurrence of long winter fears and renewal hopes across cultures suggests that climate lives not only in landscape, but in metaphor. A species that endured ice does not entirely forget the mood of ice. So the age remains, not as a complete scene we can step back into, but as a series of survivals, geological, biological, emotional, and human. It waits in museum hush around mammoth tusks. It waits in the curve of antlers mounted behind glass. It waits in the scrape marks on stone, where glaciers once moved over bedrock with a weight no human body can really imagine. It waits in every northern spring when thaw releases scents from ground that felt dead only days before. The Ice Age keeps teaching the same lesson in different forms. Nothing stays unchanged. Nothing disappears without leaving some altered shape behind. If you could walk backward through time and let the centuries fall away one by one, not in a rush, but in a slow and patient undoing, the modern world would begin to loosen around you. Fields would become marsh and forest. Roads would disappear beneath root and silt. Villages would fade. Then even the oldest monuments would be gone. Coastlines would move outward. Rivers would shift. The air would sharpen. And eventually, after enough backward steps, you would arrive at the edge of the Ice Age world where so much of our story was made. I think the first thing you would notice there would be the quiet, not the absence of sound, because the world was full of sound. Wind across open ground, distant calls of birds, the crack and groan of shifting ice, the soft percussion of hooves over frozen soil. It would be another kind of quiet, a vastness that makes each sound feel precious, a stillness in which a single fire, a single voice, a single line of tracks matters completely. In front of you, the plain would open in pale distances. Herds would move slowly. Mammoths, bison, horses, reindeer, depending on where and when you stood within the long, cold cycle. Farther away, perhaps near a river line, or the dark suggestion of scrub, predators would follow with patient economy. Above, the sky would seem larger than the one we know now, perhaps because there would be so little to interrupt it. No wires, no towers, no engines, only weather and light and the long conversation between the earth and the cold. If you turned then toward human life, you would not find kingdoms or walls. You would find signs small enough to miss if you were careless. A shelter crouched against wind. A curl of smoke. Bones arranged into frame. Hides drawn tight. Stone flakes scattered where someone sat and worked with total concentration. Tracks leading to water. A place where meat was cut and marrow broken out. A place in a cave where someone once pressed pigment into stone and left an image that can still trouble the heart. And there, more than anywhere else, the whole meaning of the Ice Age gathers. Not in the glaciers alone, though they were mighty. Not in the giants alone, though they were astonishing. It gathers in the fact that fragile humans lived here too. They watched the same horizons. They read the same weather. They carried children through the same cold. They buried their dead, painted animals, mended clothing, shaped tools, told stories, and rose each day into a world that offered no certainty except change. That may be why the Ice Age still feels so close when we let ourselves think slowly about it. It strips history back to essentials. Light, cold, hunger, shelter, attention, cooperation, memory. In that stripped world, what matters becomes visible. Fire matters. A good seam in a boot matters. The knowledge of where the herd turns matters. A friend at your side matters. The ability to keep a story alive through one more winter matters. Honestly, I do not think that lesson has ever left us. We live under different roofs now. We read weather on screens instead of in cloud and scent alone. We cross distances in hours that once took whole lifetimes to understand. But beneath all of that, some older structure remains. We still gather in circles of light against surrounding dark. We still pass warning and comfort by voice. We still make pictures of what frightens or feeds us. We still look at the land and ask whether it will hold us. The Ice Age also leaves behind a strange kind of humility. It reminds us that the world we think of as normal is only one version among many. There were ages when the sea was lower and land bridges linked continents. There were ages when forests stood back and cold grassland stretched almost without end. There were ages when giant animals moved through places now occupied by roads, farms, and apartment blocks. The present has no permanent claim on reality. It is only the current arrangement. That idea can feel dark at first. Yet there is calm in it too. Because if the world has changed this much before, then change is not a violation of nature. It is one of nature's oldest languages. The glaciers taught that slowly. They advanced. They paused. They retreated. The steppe spread. The forests followed. Animals flourished. Animals vanished. Humans adapted. The planet did not stop. It turned, breathed, and rearranged itself with the patience of deep time. Some of what the Ice Age made is visible right now wherever you are, if you know how to look. A valley floor too broad for the present river. A huge lonely stone resting where no local bedrock could have produced it. A lake occupying a basin scooped by ancient ice. A coastline shaped by drowned plains and post-glacial seas. Soil made rich by wind-blown dust from a colder and emptier world. These are not abstract traces. They are the architecture of your everyday landscape. And some traces are harder to see, but no less real. In Arctic ground, mammoths still sleep in thawing earth. In deep ice, old atmospheres still wait in bubbles. In museum drawers and cave chambers, points of bone and carved ivory and painted walls keep their long, patient silence. In the roots of reindeer and the white winter coat of the fox, the old ecological logic continues. In us, in the species that kept fire through the wind and crossed exposed continents under Ice Age skies, the inheritance remains active. There is sorrow in this story too. The giants did not stay. The mammoth steppe did not stay. The old cold world that could support such enormous abundance broke apart as warmth returned. Mammoths dwindled. Rhinoceroses vanished. Cave lions disappeared. Saber-toothed cats went still forever. Some were overtaken by climate. Some by shrinking habitat. Some, perhaps many, by the added pressure of human hunting in a changing world. Their loss still feels heavy because the imagination resists an emptying on that scale. We know now what was taken from the earth when they went. And yet, if we listen carefully, the end of the Ice Age is not told only as loss. It is also transition. Meltwater became rivers. Glacial basins became lakes. Fresh soil welcomed roots. Forests rose. New animals spread. Human groups found other ways to live, other resources to follow, other rhythms to inhabit. The world that emerged from the ice was not lesser in every way, only different. Softer in some places, richer in others, quieter perhaps in the absence of giants, but full of its own futures. You can almost feel that turning point if you imagine one evening at the threshold between ages. A band of people rests beside a fire. Behind them lies the memory of colder generations. Before them lies a land becoming greener, wetter, more wooded. The old stories of mammoth drives and endless open grass still live in the elders. The children are already learning a somewhat different world. No one around that fire can know how complete the transformation will become. No one can know that farming, villages, walls, writing, and cities lie far ahead. They only know the weather, the food, the ground beneath them, and the need to keep going. There is something deeply moving in that ordinary ignorance. History is always lived from the inside, without final explanation. The people of the Ice Age did not know they were preludes. They were simply alive. They loved and feared and endured within their own present, just as completely as we do in ours. Remembering that helps soften the distance between their time and ours. They are not theatrical ancestors, posed against scenic glaciers. They are people under pressure, making choices within a world they did not control, carrying forward enough skill and tenderness to keep the human line unbroken. So when you think of the Ice Age now, perhaps do not picture only endless white and savage cold. Picture contrast. Open grassland under pale sun. A wall of blue ice in the distance. Mammoths moving in slow, dark lines. A wolf pack waiting. A cave wall lit by flame. A hand sewing hide with a bone needle. Meltwater beginning to run. Dust carried on wind across land that would one day become fertile farmland. A child listening to a story while snow gathers at the edge of the shelter. A world harsh enough to demand everything, and alive enough to give rise to wonder anyway. That is the lasting power of this frozen age. It reminds us that the earth has never been static, that life can be abundant in severity, that beauty and danger often share the same horizon, and that survival itself can become a form of art when it is carried out with enough patience, skill, and care. If you pause on a winter night and the air is cold enough to sting a little at the nose, if the ground is hard, if the sky feels very far away, you may sense some faint closeness to that vanished time. Not because the Ice Age is returning, but because its shape never wholly left the world. It remains in stone, water, weather, migration, memory, and in the simple fact that our species learned who it was in part by facing cold without surrendering to it. And now, as the fire settles lower and the old frozen plain fades gently back into darkness, you can let that long world rest. The glaciers have withdrawn. The mammoths are quiet. The painted caves remain in their stillness. The rivers continue over ground carved before memory. And somewhere beneath all our noise and light, the age of ice is still waiting. Not gone, only deeper than the day. And maybe that is the quietest gift the Ice Age leaves us. Perspective. When you remember that whole seas moved, that continents were joined and separated, that giant beasts came and went, that our ancestors crossed exposed worlds now drowned under cold salt water. Modern urgency loosens a little, not because our lives do not matter. They do. But because they belong to a story much older and much larger than the narrow strip of time we usually inhabit. Deep time does not erase meaning. It changes the scale at which meaning is felt. I have always found sleep and deep history strangely suited to one another for that reason. Both ask you to surrender the illusion of control for a while. Both ask you to let larger rhythms carry you. In the Ice Age, no person could hurry the glacier. No hunter could command the spring to come sooner. People endured by learning the rhythm instead of fighting it blindly. There is wisdom in that, even now. To breathe with the season, to respect what is bigger than you, to take warmth seriously when it is available, to share it. If you were sitting beside one of those ancient fires at the edge of the steppe, you might not understand the full geological drama around you. You would not know the names Laurentide or Fennoscandian. You would not speak of orbital cycles or atmospheric carbon. But you would know the world directly. You would know the smell of snow before a storm, the direction from which wolves usually called, the feel of a hide boot drying too close to flame, the sound ice makes when it is safe and when it is not. Knowledge can be immense without being abstract. The Ice Age teaches that too, and perhaps that is why the story lingers so powerfully. It joins the largest scales to the most intimate ones, planetary wobble and a single human heartbeat. A continental glacier and the careful threading of a needle made from bone. A falling sea level and a child asleep beneath fur while wind moves outside. History often separates these scales. The Ice Age binds them together. It reminds us that world-changing forces are always finally lived through by bodies, by families, by creatures searching for food and shelter under a particular sky on a particular day. So let the image settle one last time. A cold horizon, a pale sun, ice blue in the far distance, grass bowed under frost, mammoths passing like slow weather, human voices low near a fire, the smell of smoke in hide, a painted wall deep in a cave, meltwater beginning to run, a forest waiting beyond the century, everything changing, everything surviving for a while in its own form. And that is enough for one night. The frozen world has shown us its severity, its beauty, its giants, its predators, its floods, its retreat, and the long, calm way it still lives inside the present. You do not have to hold every detail now. Let the plains widen and dim. Let the glaciers drift farther into silence. Let the old tracks fill gently with snow. Let the age of ice become what all deep history becomes when the mind grows tired. A vast, quiet presence just beyond the firelight. Patient, immense, and strangely kind in its scale. Good night.